The US military has always loved to develop new technology. Sometimes this technology is great, sometimes it's terrible, and sometimes it's right down the middle, good and bad. And that's the only way I can describe what we're going to be talking about today, the Sims-Dudley dynamite gun. Now, throughout this video, you'll start to realize why I have a hard time calling this an artillery piece. Because whenever you talk about artillery, artillery is all about being as far away as you can and launching your munition at a effective range to where if you're using artillery, you shouldn't even worry about the enemy attacking you or any sort of counter battery, if you will. But you'll see throughout this video, calling this an artillery piece is very questionable. There are times where if you just threw a rock at the enemy, you might be more effective than this artillery piece. So this platform came out in 1885, and what's really unique about the platform is not the name, but the actual system itself. It uses compressed air to launch the munition towards the enemy. And when you think about it, that's rather unique because if you're using air, compressed air, you don't have any smoke, so the enemy can't see where you're at, right? Well, this is where things get a little misleading because although this is a compressed air gun, it's not what we think of. You can't just walk around with air tanks on the battlefield because first off, it's extremely dangerous. Second off, it's extremely heavy. And third off, it's just not practical. So what they did was they had a special charge that created the compressed air towards the back of the cannon, and this compressed air actually would launch the munition towards the enemy. Now, what's interesting about this platform is that it has a ton of mixed reviews. Some people love it, some people hate it, but the cool thing about this is that it was actually implemented in real-time combat. A lot of these experimental weapons or technology, you don't really get to see it in action. I mean, if you can look at the US military today, we're sort of using Ukraine to see how some of our tactics might work out in real-time combat against a real big professional military. The way that the dynamite gun was sort of explained and how it sounded was quiet, but sort of like a cough. Now, this was definitely advantageous for the United States to have a cannon that's quiet. It only sounds like a cough, and you had a little bit of smoke that came out the rear of the cannon because, again, it's not necessarily compressed air. You had a little bit of a charge, but you sort of got away with it. There wasn't as much smoke as the common cannon for the days. But we run into a fatal flaw. For you to use this cannon, you have to get rather close to the enemy, and I mean pretty dang close for an artillery piece. The maximum range for this cannon was 900 meters, and when we compare that to another cannon that was used in the same conflict, the Spanish-American War, especially when we compare it to the M1897, which has a maximum range of 5,970 meters, you can see why it's really challenging to call this thing an artillery piece. Nonetheless, the Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt, actually implemented these things into combat, and he had some interesting reviews for the artillery piece. So according to him, it was amazing and terrible at the same time. So first and foremost, he was really annoyed at how many times this thing would jam. And not only that, the Rough Riders had their own machinist who would work on the broken pieces, whether that's a handheld gun or whether that's an artillery piece. You had these machinists who were working on the battlefield in real time in case something breaks down. And he would account for the dynamite gun. It would break down and it took about 2 hours to get the piece back up and running. But then he was rather happy with the results if the dynamite gun actually worked, because we haven't even got to the dynamite part yet. When this thing launched the dynamite and actually got to where it needs to be, boy, was it effective. I mean, I was a combat engineer, and I'm not going to get into the science of dynamite, but we would only use dynamite for, like, stump removal. It's a special charge in the way that it works. It pushes away, so it's very powerful. But what's even more interesting about the dynamite gun is dynamite's not even in the gun. It's something even stronger. I'm just going to describe it as a gelatinous substance that's pretty unstable if it's impacted, which is another negative to the dynamite gun. If a round touches the dynamite gun, specifically the gelatinous material, everyone's going down. In fact, the first time the dynamite gun was finally going to be used in combat, you have reports of the men sort of backing away from the dynamite gun because they were a little worried that this gelatinous material was just about to go off, especially when you're using an experimental artillery piece in actual combat and you're super close to the enemy. Again, that 900 meters we talked about, that's in perfect conditions, but when you're using a gelatinous dynamite material that has a really dinky thin tail, these things are hardly hitting their targets. But when it does hit its target or the area of its target, Theodore Roosevelt absolutely loved this thing. He even describes it almost as a terror weapon, a quiet artillery piece that sometimes hits its targets but breaks down a lot, but when it hits its targets, boy is it loud and boy is it devastating. Okay, so the US military was able to make this thing work. They love the idea of compressed air. They love the idea of a smokeless munition. They love the idea of this loud bang and boom and terrorizing the enemy opponents with their gelatinous material of dynamite. But at the end of the day, it was also incredibly impractical, and the soldiers did not really love this thing. Again, I can only imagine these men being told, you're about to get the new and best artillery piece ever, and they're probably thinking, wow, we're about to be so far away the enemy will not even hear us coming. No, you're actually going to be a lot closer to the enemy, and you're also going to be using an artillery piece that might not work. It might jam for 2 hours, and you're probably not going to hit your target, but don't worry, it's quiet, and when it does hit its target, it's effective. So again, understand when it comes to artillery, you try to get further and further away from the enemy, not closer and closer. And even back in 1885, there was an understanding on how effective artillery was. Whether you're trying to breach an enemy's castle or territory or trench line, or whether you're just trying to cause mayhem in the trenches, artillery was relevant back then, and even still is today when you look at the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. You also have to give credit where credit is due, where using compressed air in a munition was actually an idea back then. Now, I didn't mention this part, but the predecessor to this gun was actually used on naval ships with great effect. But on naval ships, you do have steam, and they had enough air to actually use compression the way it was supposed to be designed. But again, as far as using compressed air, even on today's battlefield, would be extremely annoying and extremely difficult. And even back in 1885, where you're doing a lot of the heavy lifting, it's not that practical, people. Now, I need to put this part in the video because it's a testament to how goofy Teddy Roosevelt is and the Rough Riders. They were in a war parade celebrating the Spanish-American War, like how they won the war and how brave they were. And they happened to notice one of these artillery pieces were actually like in the parade, and they started to shout and cheer for the artillery piece, even though when they were actually in combat, they could not stand this thing. It's just funny to see how you have a memory of a piece of technology that you can't stand. For anybody who's ever served in the US military, you probably hated the bad times, but for a lot of us, we actually miss the bad times sometimes. So yeah, the Sims-Dudley dynamite gun. Was it great? Was it terrible? I think it was a little bit in the middle. If they were able to really fine-tune it and to really figure it out, it would actually be highly effective. But again, you are extremely limited on that range, and that was the ultimate cause for the demise of the platform, but also the fact that it jammed all the time. And that 2-hour fixing time in combat, closer than 900 meters away, is an absolute terrible position to be in. So that's why ultimately this entire platform and program fell apart. But what's interesting is we still do use like compressed air technology. I mean, shoot, we use it on our aircraft carriers to launch aircraft away. So maybe the dynamite gun can be used on aircraft carriers today. But as far as 1885 goes, it was okay. The Spanish-American War, it was okay, effective-ish. It worked. But we're good to go. Let's get those other cannons that actually we can stay far away from the enemy, 5,000 meters away instead of 900 meters away. That's why this platform ended up falling apart. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, please leave your comments. I'm really curious to see what you guys have to say about this artillery piece, and let me know if you want me to keep making videos like this. I don't normally do too many historical breakdowns, but it's one of my favorite things to do, and I really want to start doing it. So again, let me know if you enjoyed the video, leave your comments, like, subscribe, and we'll see you later.